Words of Scripture. First from Exodus 20, the 15th verse. You shall not steal. And then from the 5th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, beginning with the 21st verse. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you are a fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. And then 1 Corinthians 13th chapter, the 11th verse. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. But when I became an adult, I put an end to my childish ways. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
I imagine you wonder oftentimes where clergy get their stories, and particularly if the ones they claim are true are really true. Well, this one is, and the witness to that fact, I see several of them out here this morning. If you want any names at this door, I'll be glad to give them to you. This is a story that a number of us shared as we were traveling a few years ago. At the conclusion of a trip to Israel, several of us stayed on and went into Jordan. We stood there as a small band of American travelers who had just crossed over the famous and totally unimpressive Allenby Bridge, and we were waiting in the no-man's land between Israel and Jordan, having come to the appointed hour of rendezvous for our guide to arrive. And sure enough, there was coming toward us a young man who was walking rather rapidly and smiling rather generously, and we assumed indeed that he was our guide. And my documentation told me that his name was spelled M-A-U-D-Y, and I assumed that simply was pronounced as Maudie. Well, when he introduced himself to me, he inserted a guttural sound between the U and the D that none of us could quite ever repeat, and he very graciously accepted the Maudie that we could pull off. First of all, he looked a little bit like most of us, but not a lot. He was short and bright-eyed and dark-haired. He wore typical Western attire, rather well-washed and neatly pressed Levi's, a tasteful T-shirt, and a ball cap. He was a Jordanian Bedouin and a sometime practicing Muslim, he indicated. His jaunty walk and his almost constant smile reassured us that we were in for a good time and probably in good hands. And well, if our ability in pronouncing Bedouin names was somewhat limited, likewise was Maudie's facility in translating native Arabic, his language, into idiomatic English, a challenge that more than once produced some rather interesting and now and then even humorous results. Well, after hours of bouncing over narrow roads and twisting switchback mountain trails on our small 15-passenger minibus, we finally arrived at our first destination, and we found ourselves high on top of a windswept plateau in Jordan, looking out dutifully in the direction that Maudie was pointing our attention to as he was shouting over the wind, trying to tell us that this was the spot where Moses stood and pointed out the promised land to the children of Israel, and we couldn't see a thing. We were hoping that Moses had better weather. It's not a very good thing to be trying to show a piece of real estate in a dust storm. Well, perhaps it was our straining to see, as well as our straining to hear, that caused Maudie to observe our expressions, and he read those expressions as the fact that we didn't know who Moses was. So he decided he'd better explain. He says, you must remember Moses, don't you? He was the one who went up on the top of Mount Sinai to receive from God the 10 recommendations. Well, we all thought that was a really good idea. We liked recommendations as opposed to commandments. and we couldn't resist laughing. The poor lad was somewhat chagrined and I think a bit insulted for a moment until I explained to him the fact that the word was not properly translated recommendations, but indeed commandments. But we all agreed that recommendations were far more acceptable. Everything from that point on was great. We had a wonderful time. But that little story brings us to the broader topic of the issue of the Ten Commandments. And what I propose to do here in the remainder of this sermon is to first define what I see to be the deeper spiritual implications, specifically this morning, of the Eighth Commandment, and then to share with you 4 important principles that are related to the deeper spiritual implications. I'd like to do here in the 21st century what Jesus was doing in the Sermon on the Mount. You see, like Moses centuries before, who went up on Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments, Jesus stood on the side of a mountain. Actually, it was not much more than a big hill that we have simply come to call the Mount of Beatitudes in subsequent years. And he took that ancient law that Moses had received from God, and he attempted to drive it to a deeper moment, or to a deeper, rather, understanding. He attempted to drive it deeper into the fiber of human experience and to give it a dimension and meaning beyond the simple surface interpretation. As John read, Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said of old," referring to the law of Moses, "that you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you," and also he went on to say, "You have heard that it was said of old, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you." Throughout Jesus' entire ministry, he was attempting the wonderful and all-important law of Moses and give it a far broader understanding and meaning. What Jesus did in the Sermon on the Mount was to take that law of Moses and give it a new dimension. Well, first of all, the 8th commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," has to do with a lot more, obviously, than the basic issue of private property rights. That's the obvious surface issue. If it doesn't belong to you, you don't take it. Jesus would say yes, but it's more than that. I want to invite you in this first point back to a moment in time, to a scene in my childhood when I was about 10 years old. And in this scene, I'm holding a quart mason jar in my hand. You know, the kind that have a kind of a blue tint to them and a solid jar lid, and they go for about $10 in an antique store today. Well, in that jar, on that particular occasion, there was $11.47. I remember that exact amount to this day. My Cub Scout den had just been dissolved because our den mother had quit and there was no one available to take her place. The collection jar had been entrusted to my care, and it was now a week since our last den meeting, and no one had asked about the collection jar. In fact, I had all but forgotten about it, and I came upon it as I was lifting up that loose board, you know, the kind that you have back in your attic closet where a kid keeps all of his special treasures. Well, there it was, that blue mason jar with $11.47. I looked at it for quite a while, puzzling over what to do with it, when I decided to just keep it. No one had asked about it. Obviously, everyone had forgotten about it. It was mine by the law. He who has it last gets to keep it. I spent the treasure in small amounts so as to not arouse suspicion about my new felt wealth. That was 1947, and money was scarce, and any apparent windfall went fully noticed by the people around you, parents and siblings, and certainly your friends. It was the perfect crime. No one ever knew it, not until now. That $11.47 haunted me for years, and in some way it still does, because I still remember the exact amount to this day. Yet it didn't haunt me enough at the time to do anything more appropriate with it than to just simply keep it. I was a thief. By every standard of human behavior, I fell into that conviction. I was a thief. I took something that didn't belong to me, but I remember wondering at the time, was that really stealing? Who of us hasn't done something like that, especially as a kid? What's wrong with it? Nobody knew but me. Everyone else had forgotten about it. The money had been collected a long time ago over a long period of time for a project that never got even talked about anymore. The den mother, who was a total loser, hadn't remembered it. In fact, the failure of the den was her fault. What did I owe her? What did I owe anybody? Nobody got hurt. I didn't really steal it. It was just after all left, and I happened to own the place where it was left. For a kid, that's an easy piece of rationalization. And if you take this commandment at its most simple and surface implication, as a kid would do, you can easily rationalize that this wasn't stealing, not in the strictest sense. After all, some of it was mine. Well, a kid thinks like that. And Paul would write later, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. And if you take this or any of the 10 Commandments at their surface implication, there are always complex and confusing situations you can use to rationalize them away and put yourself in a better light. Most of life is that complex. But Paul wrote further, when I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. What I'm trying to do in this sermon again is to help us to go below the surface of the commandment and to see its deeper implications. For me now, some 50 plus years later, after the mason jar incident, putting an end to childish ways, the deeper issue that is involved here, I have come to understand, is beyond taking something that doesn't belong to me. But the deeper issue here is the issue of personal integrity. It is more than protecting private property. The dictionary defines integrity as an uncompromising adherence to a code of moral, artistic, or other values, utter sincerity, honesty, and candor, avoidance of deception, expediency, artificiality, or shallowness of any kind. Wow, does that nail the mason jar incident or not? Was any of that present in what the 10-year-old boy did 50 years ago? It sure was. But what 10-year-old, and for that matter, how many of us think that deeply and that abstractly and that complexly? If the core issue goes beyond the theft of things that don't belong to us, then we may end up stealing more than the material possessions that belong to other people. If we decide to take the 8th commandment seriously, probing deeper than its surface, and if we have made a commitment to ourselves and to God to live more compassionately and responsibly as Jesus calls us to do, then I believe that there are at least 4 key principles that can help us live with greater wholeness and integrity in our daily lives. And by the way, these are not my 4 principles. To be honest with you, I've taken them from someone else. I'll make this straight. Integrity principle number 1. Take time to carefully think through complex situations. When faced with a tough dilemma, don't settle for a quick solution that may hurt you or someone else simply because it was not carefully thought out. And even when you take time to think through complex situations, there is no guarantee that you're going to get it right, so to speak. To share a story with you, a friend of mine called me. This was an incident several years ago. He lives in another state. He called me one evening, wanted to talk about a dilemma that he was facing. He had recently married a woman a few years older than he who had 3 children. He was enjoying his instant fatherhood, but he and his wife had dreamed of having a child of their own marriage. And a job offer was presenting itself to him, and it would make possible this dream of another child to come true. First of all, it was more money. Secondly, it was a second shift job that would put him at home during the day to care for this hoped-for new addition to their family. But that circumstance would put him home when the rest of the family was either at work or at school. He'd have to give up his place in a choir in his church that meant a great deal to him, something that gave him spiritual nurture and gave him an opportunity to celebrate his faith. On the other hand, his present job was a good one, but his boss hadn't kept promises that were made, and things seemed to be going from bad to worse. His wife wanted him to take the new job, but he wasn't so sure. He didn't like being separated from his stepchildren, whom he felt needed a father's presence. We talked for nearly an hour and a half on the phone. We even prayed together about this dilemma. It seemed that no matter which way he turned, he was taking something from somebody, from his wife, his stepchildren, from himself, from his employer, from someone. Where was integrity to be served? It was served simply in the fact that he pondered and carefully journeyed through this dilemma. And even then, there was no guarantee that he had made the right decision. Integrity principle number 2, confront your habits of being sneaky, deceptive, or insensitive. Well, the mason jar incident with its $11.47 in it was a clear example of sneaky, deceptive, and insensitive behavior. At 10 years of age, I had been most successful in deceiving myself in that little scenario, and I think many of us have been in situations in which we slip into deception and dishonesty and insensitive behavior. Take this little test, for example. Have you ever found yourself impatient in a conversation and interrupting people and finishing someone's sentence? Well, it's called taking the floor from someone else. And are you ever rude or cold, for that matter, especially those whom you perceive as below you in status or intelligence? It's called robbing someone of his or her self-esteem. Have you ever exaggerated or misrepresented your credentials or your contribution to a project in order to impress people? It's called taking credit that is not yours. Have you occasionally found yourself doing something you know is unkind or marginally immoral or even possibly illegal in business because you haven't been able or willing to develop better options? It's called taking the easy way out. Do you ever feel as though you are faking it or doing whatever will get people to like you better? It's called conning someone. Do you sometimes take advantage of people's innocence, their niceness, or even their trust? It's called taking advantage instead of earning it. We all know that these are patterns we'd be better off without. And where did they come from? Well, perhaps they grew out of some perceived necessity that developed at an early age and then just hung around much too long. Children, for example, learn to be deceptive in order to avoid parental outbursts in an ever-growing desire to keep what children desperately want to keep, and that's peace in the family. Parents rob their children of the skill to be honest when they fail to be accepting and forgiving and open to listening to a child's needs. Thou shalt not steal. Integrity and wholeness come to our lives when we bring our behaviors in harmony with the values that we claim. Integrity principle number 3, anticipate when doing the right thing will be unpopular. One of the main reasons cited for compromising principles on the job is the real and or perceived matter of workplace risk, making an unpopular decision, one that might even get you in trouble with the boss or co-workers, and even may cause you to lose your life or your job, rather. But you know it's the right thing to do. I was having coffee a couple of weeks ago with a frequent visitor here at Wayzata Community Church. He happens to be a CEO of a large and high-profile company of the Twin Cities. And we got onto the topic of what's going on in the business world today, particularly what's going on with CEOs and their rather questionable tactics in terms of feathering their own nests and a variety of other things that we're all very much aware of. In fact, this gentleman has actually taught courses on business ethics in his previous church, and he cited a comment that frequently came from the discussions on the topic. People will say something, well, it's one thing for you as a CEO of a company to be honest and to stand for integrity. But I'm in middle management. I've got people above me and people below me. And if I speak out, I'm in significant risk. Life in the workplace can be very dangerous. My resource on this topic suggested 5 ways to protect yourself as you anticipate doing something that may not be popular and may even be risky. First of all, find out who else in your company behaves ethically and cultivate allies who will back you if your decency is challenged. Secondly, document what you do and how you feel and what you're thinking and what you're deciding when you're in dangerous waters. Third, this source suggests to take time to pray, to meditate, or to read inspiring writings that will support your inner strength and inform your daily struggles with ethical issues. Fourth, find people in other places, not just in your workplace, but in other parts of your life, who share principles like yours and who hang out with people who do, and hang out with them yourselves on a regular basis to help strengthen your resolve to live a life of honesty and integrity. And finally, become active in industrial and professional associations that support integrity and honesty in the business world. Cultivate allies for emotional support for the ethical battles where you work. Ethical behavior usually flourishes wherever it finds support. And finally, integrity principle number 4. Share a portion of what you have with people who have less. Many of the scholarly writings on the 8th commandment point to this spiritual obligation and to its corollary, to make sure that others who don't need to steal in order to feed or clothe their families. This deeper spiritual obligation is expanded upon in the book of Leviticus in the 9th chapter, where it reads, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field to its very borders. Neither shall you gather the gleaning after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, nor shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God." Other Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and Native American spiritual traditions explain the reason for this generosity in similar terms. In Islam, the Quran insists that the human desire for acquiring wealth or status must be balanced by fair play, a sense of honor, and the annual poor due, the distribution of a portion of one's holdings to those who are in need. Bearhart, a Native American healer from New Mexico, wrote this in his book, The Wind is My Mother. To be replenished, we need to keep emptying ourselves to receive more. In that way, we become vessels, holding one hand to receive the blessing and then opening the other hand so that we can let those blessings loose into the lives of others. Thou shalt not steal. You can steal more than a person's material possessions, and most of us do it in subtle ways that only the sensitive and loving person sees and understands. And one way of stealing is simply by not sharing. In closing, I'd like to share a little personal family story, one that is true. But I'm going to change a name of one person. I'm not quite sure why. You probably wouldn't know him anyway. But this is the story of a man whom I will call Bill Morgan. Bill was a trusted and highly regarded man, active in the community affairs through his church, as well as the YMCA, where my wife Ann worked at the time. He was involved in his kids' sports. He was the ideal husband and father and community leader. And then one day, some incredible news broke in the papers and even on the evening TV newscasts. The auditors of the prestigious First National Bank of Chicago had just completed a long investigation into a major case of embezzlement, and they had arrested Bill and put him in jail. He confessed to the crime and went to prison and paid his debt. Everyone was shocked. What he had stolen turned out to be more than the money from the largest bank in the city of Chicago. What he stole was the trust that an entire community and the people he loved who had invested their love in him. Everyone felt betrayed. He stole his family's position in the community and his kids' sense of pride in their dad, who was larger than life to them as well as to most of their peers. But remarkably, the family remained intact. Some years later, then, our own son, Matt, who was too young at the time, but who by this time was now an adult, came home one evening to tell us that he had just hired a young man in his company, and by golly, he was the son of someone that his mom knew. He was Bill Morgan's son. Somehow the two boys had put the facts of their lives together and come out realizing that their parents knew each other. Well, Ann and I decided not to steal any of Matt's enthusiasm by sharing information about Bill's past. We decided not to steal Bill's regained reputation or to give Matt information he didn't need to deal with and to rob him of the joy of a new friendship. Thou shalt not steal. You see, gossip steals too, even when the story is true. Gossip to me is the passing on of information that destroys and that is unnecessary, regardless of its truth. And we all thought we weren't thieves. If we look at the deeper spiritual implications of the eighth commandment, more than a recommendation, we could well have stolen stuff we didn't even know that we'd taken, like someone's self-esteem or their identity or their pride, a child's ability to learn to be honest by making it necessary for them to be deceptive in order to avoid our anger and our rejection, in order to keep peace in the household. And Jesus would later come and offer a new law beyond even integrity, a new commandment that you love one another even as I have loved you. And Paul would advance the thought as he wrote to the church in Corinth and declared that beyond respecting each other's private property, that we love one another and be patient and kind and bear all things, for love is greater than faith and greater than hope. Because you see, through love, the law becomes written not just in a book, but on our hearts. And then who could take what doesn't belong to them?